線の八丁堀の駅、気持ちが悪くなった者2名がいるそうです。事故とやもしれませんが、詳細判然としません。
This is the first alert of the atrocity by the Aum Supreme Truth cultists, and in the coming hour, calls for help and emergency reports would flood in as chaos overtook the Tokyo subway system.
20 years ago, the nation of Japan was rocked with an event they still consider to be their version of 9/11. Using sarin gas, a homegrown terrorist group pumped the deadly chemical into the Tokyo subway system. 12 commuters were killed. More than 5,000 went to hospital. And they are still learning difficult lessons about an event that is, if it were truly successful, might have killed thousands. Our guest is Director of Japan Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, specializing in Asian regional security and political issues. Welcome Michael Auslin to MidPoint today. Mike, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You wrote an article in The Australian, published on the 24th, and the one line that I took out of that really captured me. It was one of the first cases of homegrown terrorism in a developed democracy, a specter that today darkens the West. 20 years later, have we spent enough time to learn from that moment?
Well, I think the problem is that we treated Aum, because it happened in Japan, as isolated, that it was indicative of a deeper problem in society, of alienation, of religious death cults, of people who were willing to murder innocent civilians, and instead decided to, be shocked and terrified by it, but not really do anything about it. And today, in ways, Aum Shinrikyo was a harbinger of what we face here in the West now, with our own young men and women joining ISIS and going off to fight for another religious death cult, in the specter of an international terrorist movement, which is what Aum was, because they operate in Australia and they tried to operate in Africa, and in a government that was more concerned about protecting religious liberties, because Aum as an actual religious organization, than in protecting the public. So I think the lessons are still there, and it's one now that sadly has come to bear on everyday life.
You mentioned Aum, and that's Aum Shinrikyo, that was the name of the actual group itself that was involved in the event inside the subway system. You also use the words shocked and terrified, and I think that's correct. People there were shocked, were terrified that something like this could happen right in the middle of a major downtown area. Why then do we see ourselves caught now in the moment of ISIS, when we have Americans who are training here, living here, going overseas, fighting against America? We still seem to be shocked and terrified. What's wrong with us that we can't catch up?
Well, I think part of the problem is that we find it difficult, if not impossible, to put ourselves in the mindsets of those who embrace death as the ultimate goal of life. I mean, this is what Aum did. By the way, Aum did not just undertake the one attack in Tokyo. Instead, they had already released sarin into another city in Japan. They used VX nerve gas, the only group known to do that, and killed one person with it. They did old-fashioned murder and murdered innocent families. So the idea that we can somehow put ourselves into their mind and try to understand why the elite, and they were the elite of Japanese society, were choosing this path, that's something we're still not good at in terms of dealing with ISIS, and now you have a problem that has metastasized around the region. It didn't happen with Aum. Aum was shut down largely by the Japanese government, but elements of it still exist today.
Well, let's look at it this way too, because apparently when the police went into the headquarters of Aum after the Tokyo attack, they found a biological warfare laboratory that had anthrax, chemical weapons, and conventional weapons. Now, this is 20 years ago. Have the Japanese learned enough? Well, let's go even a step further here. What have the Japanese learned, and how have they changed their approach to these homegrown terrorists 20 years later?
Well, it's a good question. Japan obviously has not suffered a similar attack since. They didn't go as far as we did after 9/11 and have the equivalent of a Patriot Act. They did invade or take down Aum's operating base. They disestablished it as an organized religion, but it still exists as a religious group. And there are two different offshoots of it, and what the Tokyo police do, or the national police do, is simply keep an eye on it. But they have not found a way, or have not been willing to say that this is no legitimate religion. It's a mishmash of Christian and Buddhist and apocalyptic ideas that really doesn't have any religious purpose. And so they let it exist, and it's still run by disciples of the founder of Aum Shinrikyo, who, by the way, is still sitting on death row for the actions that his group perpetuated 20 years ago. So the Japanese have gone part of the way to trying to control it. But even so, they haven't taken those final steps to say, how do we, as a society, ensure that we protect ourselves in the long run by shutting down these types of groups? And that's certainly what the West has not been willing to do, either in Europe or in America, to protect ourselves from radical Islam.
A couple of minutes that we have left here. In your opinion, and looking at this story, looking 20 years later, what are those steps that now need to be taken, not just by Japan, but by the West, but by the United States, to try and make sure that we are better protected?
Well, I think you don't give oxygen to these groups. Look, the Japanese authorities knew for years about Aum Shinrikyo, and they did really nothing to stop them, in part because they were protected as a religious organization. In essence, they gave them oxygen to grow.
Is that the key right there, though, when you talk about being protected as a religious organization? And I realize there are people who are going to talk about freedom of religion, protection of religion as well. But is that something that needs to be drilled down into a lot deeper?
Well, I think it's something we have to think about. At least Islam not going away. Anything, it's spreading. And if you decide that you're not going to really pursue the groups that abet it, that raise money for it, and certainly the ones that run the types of madrasas that poisonous ideology, then you're always going to be on the defensive and playing catch up. The Japanese did a better job of shutting down this one group, but they haven't killed it entirely. And we in the West are far too afraid to take those steps, which may make a difference in the broader struggle and fight that we and our allies have in the Middle East.
Are we looking at the possibility, the very likely possibility of catastrophe here coming to America by not learning?
Well, look, we already had catastrophe. We had catastrophe on 9/11, and we spent a decade trying to ignore the growth of Al-Qaeda, ignore the threat that it posed. We already had a separate bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. We didn't learn the lesson, and we paid the price. The fact that almost 15 years after that event, that our leaders, including the president, tell us we are less safe than before and that these groups are larger and widespread than they were before, means that if you're a betting person, you have to expect that there is another catastrophe out the waiting. If you get serious about stopping it, the way the Japanese will pay the price.
A lousy bet that no one wants to make. Michael Auslin, fascinating to look back. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right. Here is something no one has thought of yet when it comes to those gunning for the presidency like Ted Cruz. A little matter of money and skirting the laws. It's coming up next right here on MidPoint.